We all know the government watches us, but how much, and to what end? Today we look at the question, is government domestic surveillance keeping us safer? We're going to analyze talking points published in the CQ Researcher by Rob Rosenzweig of the Heritage Foundation and Sharon Franklin of the Constitution Project. Today's episode of Wake Up America is sponsored by Reynolds Brand Tinfoil, guaranteed to keep moisture in and harmful government radiation out. It's Wake Up America with Daniel Koster. Paul Rosenzweig is on the yes side of the question of government surveillance and whether it keeps us safe. He says we can't prove that it is, but there are enough examples where we know that it helped, and there are probably more classified ones. He says that surveillance cameras helped catch the failed Times Square bomber and the Boston bombers. He says that the NSA tells us they've accessed the record 300 times in the last 10 years, and that they say this access has helped prevent terrorist attacks. However, if we only focus on the thwarted attacks, we're forgetting that the point is deterrence, and that once these tactics become public, terrorists switch to less optimal tactics to avoid detection. Surveillance programs may not be ethical or legal, he says, but they work. Sharon Franklin takes the opposite side. She says the Office of National Intelligence says that the program Snowden exposed prevented 54 attacks, but they never gave us any information about any of these attacks. She also says that they never showed a link between these specific programs and stopping the terrorists. Some of that info needs to stay classified, which is why it's important to have a debate about the extent of these programs before they ever become implemented. Even if the program works against terror, she says, it also collects a lot of unnecessary data from Americans with no ties to terror. The courts said that metadata doesn't require a warrant to collect, but now that we are so wired, they may change their mind on that, she says, and she cites U.S. versus Jones as an example that we'll get to later. The data the NSA collects might keep us safe, but it also goes a lot farther than it needs to in violating our constitutional rights. There are a couple of logical points to analyze in Rosenzweig's piece before we get to the factual ones. First of all, he cites as successes for the surveillance programs the capture of the Times Square bomber and the Boston bombers. But in neither of these cases did surveillance act to save lives. The Times Square bomber failed to bomb Times Square and was only caught after he tried. The Boston bombers were only caught after by looking at surveillance cameras from nearby stores. If that's your idea of government surveillance, then you betray a good deal of ignorance about who Edward Snowden is. Rosenzweig also says that the point of these surveillance programs is deterrence. Once terrorists know about the programs, they'll be less likely to use conventional means to communicate and will be made less efficient. But if that's the case, why did the NSA go to such lengths to keep these programs secret? And why are they so angry at Edward Snowden for revealing them? Just like in the case of nuclear deterrence, you want your enemy to know about the extent of your power. So it should come as no surprise that a great deal of this conversation will be informed by the revelations of Edward Snowden. Rosenzweig reassures us that the NSA has only accessed the phone record 300 times in the past 10 years. But our confidence about this should be somewhat shaken by at least one document revealed to us by Edward Snowden. One of these documents describes an incident in which an agent meant to listen to phone calls in Egypt, where the country code is 20, but he accidentally typed in 201, causing him to listen to phone calls from Washington, D.C. Apparently he intercepted hundreds, and nobody knew about it until Snowden told us. I say if it's possible to listen to our phone calls on accident, then it's too easy to listen to them on purpose. This also tells us that if any one agent decides to listen to one of our phone calls, there's nothing stopping them from doing so, and they probably won't get in trouble for it. But all of that might be worth it if these programs had really prevented 54 attacks, as Sharon Franklin quotes the Office of National Intelligence as reporting. Now, this commentary from the CQ Researcher was published on August 30th, 2013. On October 2nd, Director of the NSA General Keith Alexander gave testimony to a Senate Judiciary Committee in which he confessed that that number was slightly high and that the real number was more like 1 or 2. The transcripts of the hearing have been made public, and you can go read them if you want. So if even the director of the NSA, who has since stepped down by the way, confesses that there's really no evidence any of this has actually prevented terrorism, that what consolation could we possibly hope for that these programs are not just an outright violation of our rights for no reason? Well, all we can hope for is that they're not really a violation of our rights. I mean, we hear over and over again that these programs only gather metadata, information about who's calling whom and for how long, and nothing about the actual content of the calls. Now, on the question of whether gathering metadata constitutes a search on the part of the U.S. government, Sharon Franklin cites a 2012 Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Jones. In this case, police investigators continued to gather data from a GPS placed on a suspect's car long after the warrant had expired. The Supreme Court decided unanimously that gathering data from a GPS constituted a search and required a warrant, and that the police officers had violated the law by continuing to gather data after the warrant had expired. So it seems pretty cut and dry that metadata, which is certainly what GPS data is, I mean, they weren't gathering data about what the defendant was doing while he was at these places. It was just a matter of where he was going. And it's the same thing with phone calls. They don't gather data about what happens during these calls. They only look at who's calling whom. There's certainly an analogy to be made here. But where the case becomes interesting and where it becomes a little bit less clear-cut is in the justification. This is a case in which all the Supreme Court justices agreed on the verdict, but they disagreed as to the reasoning behind it. Scalia and a few of the other justices said that placing a GPS in someone's car is a trespass on their property, which police are only allowed to do with a warrant, and that that's the reason that their actions were unconstitutional. Alito dissented, however, and said that watching somebody's movement over months tells you a lot more about their life than watching them over just a day. I mean, if you notice that they go to church every week, or they go to a bar every night, or they're going to certain clinics, this can tell you a whole lot about their life, and that's the kind of investigation that a warrant is required for. So under Alito's definition, the gathering of metadata is unconstitutional without a warrant, because if you watch somebody's phone calls over and over again for months, you're going to learn everything you could possibly need to know about their life, and that would be unconstitutional. But under Scalia's definition, it's only constitutional if it involves a trespass on somebody's property. And listening in on phone calls, while it might once have required placing a bug inside their house, can now just be done digitally. You can just either splice into a phone line or demand the information from the phone company. So this is where we get into an interesting problem about whether metadata is constitutional or not. However, either way, I think the spirit of this ruling shows all the justices in agreement that gathering this kind of information about people does constitute a search, and that it tells you a lot about them, and that the NSA should be getting a warrant for doing it on everyday people. So the verdict on this debate that was published in CQ Researcher puts me in an interesting position, because as best as I can tell, Paul Rosenzweig offers no legitimate justification for these programs, and Sharon Franklin doesn't say enough about the problems with these programs, and even the concessions that she makes about their possible merits turned out to be factually inaccurate. In my view, there is no justification for this kind of mass data mining on the part of the NSA. But whatever my opinion is, it should be agreeable that no good justification is offered in this debate from the CQ Researcher. I do not disagree with the premise that it may sometimes be worth giving up a little bit of freedom in exchange for a little bit of security. Human life is precious, and sometimes we have to make sacrifices to defend it. But according to CDC figures, the 10 leading causes of death in the US, led by heart disease, cancer, and respiratory illness, make no mention even of murder, much less terrorism. This was the case before 9/11, and remains so in spite of it. So I, for one, would much rather sacrifice some of my freedom in exchange for protection against these mass killers, long before I would start giving them up to protect against terrorism.